Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Today, we are so excited to welcome award-winning author Michael J. Cooper to the show, and he's joining us to talk about his award-winning novel, Wages of Empire. I mean, we are going into the Great War of Civilization. In fact, this kind of takes me back to childhood history, history class, but you know what? Historical fiction is always better than sometimes sitting in school with a textbook. Wouldn't you say, Michael? Welcome.
Absolutely. Well, I'll try not to make it sound too didactic, but there's a lot to learn here. But again, hopefully it'll go down easily.
Oh, no, I think that's the beauty of, historical novels. And then, it's a coming of age story too, which I think is something that we can all immediately relate to, because I think no matter what our age is, we're still coming of age.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
yeah, and so the hero of the piece indeed is a 16-year-old young man, and that really does, I think, introduce a good way of drawing the reader into a personal story, because it's his journey that we focus on, although there's so much going on around that that impacts him either directly or indirectly for the present. It is, I think, an important
Mm.
linchpin.
I think we kind of forget about the Great War of Civilization too. I think
I
I,
haven't forgotten about it lately while I've been writing this, that's for sure.
yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. But it kind of ties into history of today, right? You
Yeah,
know?
well, that's the thing, because the map that we have today, especially of the Middle East, was largely drawn after the Great War, after the
Mm.
war of 1914 and 1918, 1919. And we're still basically dealing with the results of the resolution that happened at Versailles.
Okay, so it's still happening, and
Yeah.
obviously and you lived in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah, I emigrated when I was almost Evan's age. He's the hero of the piece. A little later, I was 17 when I first arrived there in 1966, and
Oh, 19.
I stayed there for 11 years.
Wow. And then didn't you go to college there
Yeah, I
too?
went to school there
Mm.
after a year of just learning Hebrew. Then I
Oh,
went to
wow.
university for a couple of years, and then I managed to get into medical school. I'm not sure exactly how I managed, but I tried and tried, and I got into medical school in Tel Aviv in 1969.
Wow, I always thought that Israel was at the top of the world in regards to medicine, you know?
Well, that's the way they feel in Israel about it. Yes. No, the fact of the matter is that it is a fine system there, and many Israelis, sometimes have to go abroad to study.
Mm,
It happens here in this country as well, in the United States. And so a lot of Israelis go to Romania or Germany or
mm.
Italy. And, I was considering that before I finally got accepted. I'm glad I
Oh,
did to go study at Padova in Italy.
wow. I mean, okay, so this is the other thing. So you've traveled around, and I think that's something that lends itself of being able to tell a historical story that's true but still fiction, right? Having been to these places, and because they're so ancient in history compared to America, obviously we're ancient in a Native American people history, but when it comes to these kind of wars, and going to just some of the ruins and the buildings, um, they tell the story of people.
Indeed. And that was one of the things that impressed me, because it seemed like everywhere I went when I first arrived in Israel in 1966, history was always around the corner, because the fact that the Turks had occupied uh, Palestine under the Ottoman Empire for 6 centuries practically. And basically, this was the backwaters of their empire. And so very little changed. And so when you're looking at the Temple Mount, for example, you're basically like in a time machine looking back 700 years practically, because nothing changed really. And so there was that sense of uh, being a moment in time that was preserved,
Mm,
inadvertently perhaps, but preserved. So the places that I write about in 1918 were largely unchanged. And so it's
mm,
always interesting to look at old journals and old travel guides, and to see exactly the change of the name, certainly, that go with the change of empire from the Ottoman Empire to the British Empire, then to Israel and Jordan. Obviously, the names change a bit, but the places remain largely unchanged.
And Jordan, that's interesting too. I mean, I do believe that's somewhere where the oldest wine comes from. Well, it's like the birthplace of wine. There's like that whole region, and people
I think
forget that too. It's
there
not
may,
Napa. I love
it,
Napa,
it
but just
isn't
saying.
it isn't Napa, but I'm sure that a lot of places in the Mediterranean area would claim to be the oldest.
Yeah, we've done some interviews on the history of wine, and Lebanon came up as one of the top places. And yeah, that a
I,
researcher, a scientist on wine, he was
I,
in Jordan, and that's what he said. That's
I,
it. It comes
I
from there.
defer. I defer. It obviously is well aged.
That's right. That yes, yeah, I don't drink it from way back then, but but going to the story, can you give everyone just an overview of the story of the book? Because I don't want to ruin it for people, but just give them a little overview, but don't sell it out.
Okay. Well, I would start with the cover that you have hovering over your
I love
shoulder,
that
hovering
cover.
over mine, because what we see here is that the cover is dominated by two images: the old city of Jerusalem down below in dark blue
Mhm,
colors, and above it, a murky sky wherein we see Kaiser Wilhelm II. And so clearly, the book largely deals with the old city of Jerusalem and the Kaiser. When you, however, look at, for example, the copy on the back of the book, it starts with another narrative. In the summer of 1914, 16-year-old Evan Sinclair leaves home to join the Great War for Civilization. So suddenly we have this character, Evan Sinclair. And
mm,
the question then is for the reader, what does he have to do with the Kaiser and with Jerusalem? And we see that in the next sentence here. Little does Evan know that despite the war raging in Europe, the true source of conflict will emerge in Ottoman Palestine, since it's from Jerusalem, where the German Kaiser dreams to rule as Holy Roman Emperor. And so that's the connection, because
mm,
Evan is basically entering a field of action that largely has to do with the machinations of the Kaiser.
mm,
And what I draw out as the book begins, even, is the realization of that
mm,
fact that largely eludes us when we learn history. That
mhm,
Wilhelm is sort of at the center in regards to starting. We all hear about Franz Josef and the assassination in Sarajevo, but we don't really know what was behind the scenes. And indeed, there was a lot of maneuvering over
mm,
decades in regards to what Kaiser Wilhelm did. So this basically is a hero's journey. The hero is Evan Sinclair. If we use the
mhm,
archetypes of Joseph Campbell, uh, this young man then is the person who occupies that role, that archetype. And if
mm,
he's the hero, who's the villain? Kaiser Wilhelm. And
mm,
he is an amazing character. He's really a buffet of the bizarre from the standpoint of what he brings in his personality. Um, there's a wonderful description of him from a German historian about uh, his personality. And I would just want to read this just
sure.
to throw that into the mix. This is a historian, for those who are interested, Thomas Nipperdary, who wrote this in the early part of the 20th century. While Wilhelm was gifted with a quick understanding, he was at the same time superficial, hasty, restless, unable to relax, without any deeper level of seriousness, without any sense of sobriety, without any concern for balance or boundaries, or even for reality and real problems, uncontrollable and scarcely capable of learning from experience, desperate for applause and success, romantic, sentimental, and theatrical, unsure and arrogant, with a
Wow.
hyperactive sense of grievance and an exaggerated bravado and desire to show off, to be the supreme warlord.
Wow.
This is kind of an interesting character, and this kind of comes out as he
Mhm,
interacts with people around him and with the world at large.
mm,
So basically, what we have here that is a hero's journey of a young man into this very larger than life adventure,
Mm.
and how this is basically revolving around the machinations of one man uh, and his aspirations, especially as it related to Jerusalem.
Well, I think this is the thing about history, right? It's always about getting into the psyche of the people who are leading at the time. I mean, that's really the thing is this history is so fascinating because it's like, why did this person do this? And then, life-changing events happen just from one person. And this kind of his personality, there's still people running around doing that same thing. I'm just saying.
Yeah, without naming names, there are people who
Just
actually
saying.
fit that description pretty well.
Yeah.
What's also amazing is not just the character of the Kaiser, which is amazing enough, that allows a person such as a writer to approach a book like this with such a rich amount of
Mhm.
material. You also have amazing characters like Gertrude Bell, the great archaeologist and explorer, and an amazing woman in her time. In any time, you have T.E. Lawrence,
Mhm.
you have Winston Churchill, you
Oh,
have
wow.
people who are large, and they're basically all populating this book, in addition to people actually on the ground in Ottoman Palestine at that point. In
Mm.
particular, we have the Hashemites, that is Emir Faisal and his father Hussein in Mecca.
Mhm.
And you have, on the other hand, you have the early Zionists. You have Asher Ginsburg, who's also called Ahad Am, and you also have um, Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel. So you have these major players before they were even major players on this field of battle.
This must have been fun to write, but to me, you're lucky you have like computers now because this would be what we would call the chart of the world. My mom tried to write a historical novel once, and this was way back when, I think in the early 80s maybe.
Yeah.
And at this point, eventually our actual living room, and she's an artist, all the art came down. And a friend who had a newspaper, like go figure, we have friends in newspapers, but gave us a big roll of newsprint, the actual paper, and we rolled it around and we did the chart of the world because she couldn't type, like, did they have a typewriter in China at this time? And she was just doing a historical novel in Kenya where we
Yeah.
lived. And
Yeah.
so it just we next thing you know, I'd come home from school and have to like help fill out this chart. The book never got written. The
That must
chart
be one
was
hell of a chart, though.
one heck of a chart. I wish we still had it today, because it was pretty epic. And so getting into your book, because I think you are an excellent writer. I'm at the beginning of it, but your writing, you really set the scene. And I think it is really to be able to pack that much history. You have a use of characters, like you identify with the characters, but you really get into the setting immediately. I mean, it's just you're in the book, you are in the story. You're an incredible writer, and so I'm excited. So that's why I say don't no spoilers for me, but
I won't say a
but
word.
no, but and or for the audience, we want them to get the book. But to be able to put this all together, like how long did it take you to do? I mean, you're lucky you have computers. As was my point.
Well, when I started this adventure, this was in the mid 90s, frankly. And
Mm,
so this book actually grew out of those earlier writings. I started actually writing historical fiction after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and with that, unfortunately, came the death of the peace process that
yeah.
he had begun. There's a lot of debating about the quality of the Oslo Accords, but frankly, they were a stepwise journey to create trust. And sadly, trust is a real missing commodity in the Middle East right now.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he was assassinated by a right-wing extremist, Israeli, who basically didn't want to see the peace process. In that case,
Mm,
it became almost a strange bedfellow with people in Hamas who also did not want to see
mhm,
a peace process. Each side wanted just one state between the river and the sea, that is, between the Jordan River
mm,
and the Mediterranean. The people of Hamas wanted that to be an Islamic state.
mhm,
The ultra nationalistic Jews wanted that to be a Jewish state. But
mm,
ultimately, it's a land that is claimed credibly arguably, by two people. And
Mm.
I'm hoping that we're going to get back to a way to create some type of accord based on two
Yeah.
for two people. But that's a
Mm.
side issue. The writing, as you initially asked before I launched into that tangent, started in the mid 90s before I had the advantage of a computer, but I did
Oh,
steal. I stole my mother's Encyclopedia Judaica, which
uh-huh.
came in very handy. And of course, I had a lot of wonderful adventures on the internet in buying old uh, travel guides, old biographies that are out of print. And so there was a wealth of books that I accumulated that basically inform. So, for example, when I'm writing about T.E. Lawrence, I have his collected letters. I have
Wow.
all of his original books. When I'm writing about Gertrude Bell, the same thing. I have all of her collected letters. I have,
Wow.
all of her writings and her translations of Persian poetry, for example. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
there's a lot that goes into it. But again, I started this process that led to Wages of Empire long ago. But because before it brought me to Wages of Empire, I published a book in 2011 called Foxes in the Vineyard. That's set in
Hmm.
1948
Oh.
at the transition from British
Oh, yeah.
Palestine to Israel and Jordan. And that's the world that I found 18 years later when I came
Mm.
to Israel and in Jerusalem in particular. I was living 100 yards away from the border between Israel and Jordan. And I would look over into the old city of Jerusalem during that first year
Wow.
when I was 17, 18 years old. So this is a topography that I'm familiar with.
Hmm.
It's a story that I love because I've grown up learning
Hmm.
about this in different iterations. When I was a boy, grown into adolescence, I was very active in the Zionist movement. When I came to Israel, and one of the
Hmm.
reasons I came was because of Zionism,
Hmm.
I learned about the other narrative, as
Hmm.
especially when at university I met Palestinian guys from either East Jerusalem, the territories, or from within the Green Line. And then I understood their narrative. And just as I felt a connection with this land, I came quickly to understand that they had a very strong connection. Just as I had a love of this land, they had a love of that land. And so I really was able to develop
Hmm.
that real sense, and that stayed with me.
Hmm.
So in regards to the writing of this, again, Foxes in the Vineyard came before it. And then I did another book called The Rabbi's Night that's set at the transition from the Crusades to the Mamluk Caliphate
Ooh.
in 1290 at the end of the Crusades. And so, those were also wonderful touch points. And this now is sort of set somewhere between the Crusades and 1948. But this is now a wonderful way to continue the story because there are some through lines through all these books. And
Hmm.
one of them is uh, the Holy Land, in particular, Jerusalem.
Sure.
And the other connecting thread is the Sinclair bloodline. And so the
Mm.
fact that Evan Sinclair is here is no happenstance. He's part of the continuing story.
Okay. Well, the first thing that came to me that I wanted to ask you when I started reading is, Evan getting out there at 16, and there's so many stories, even American Civil War stories of young men, even, younger than 16, going to war
Yeah.
and having that. I mean, and I understand, like, we live shorter spans of life as we do now as human beings. So now we're the jolly green giants. We'll live till 100 and something, But when you go to have that kind of conviction to do something like that, and not, what's out of it? I forget what I'm saying with this. Like you're not gonna, you have that strong to go to war and that belief system. That had been something interesting to explore as a writer.
Well, indeed, and the fact of the matter is that when I went to Israel and I was there during 1967, as the situation was growing very dire because the president of Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, which is an act of war. And there were
Wow.
about 4 weeks or so of great tension, rising tension.
Mm,
That's basically what it was called in Israel, the days of tension. And during that time, you know, just as now, if we look at a world in turmoil from a distance, there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do about it. But if we're
mm,
right on site, then we can do something. So my
mm,
response was to go down to the draft board in Jerusalem and to volunteer. I just, I had to
mm.
because I felt very strongly about what was going on. I gave them my phone number, and I'm still waiting for the call
Ah,
to come yet. In the ensuing, 50 years or so. And I was actually kind of relieved that it didn't because I was very ambivalent,
yeah.
but felt strongly enough to do it. And so I could get inside the way that Evan was feeling as he was sawing what
Mm,
was happening in the world. He also wanted to get away from his controlling father. That's the
mm.
other issue.
See, that is a reoccurring thing that we have actually seen on many stories that are true stories of men in the military. Of you know, we do a Military Monday show every first Monday is a military history show, and um, going into even just like Lee Marvin, the actor Lee Marvin, right? Had a really bad upbringing, but
Hmm.
went off on his own, went hunting in the Everglades in the national park area now. Wasn't a national park, I don't think then yet, but he grew up on the land. And there's so many generals and they're really the rogue generals. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying that they're rogue isn't bad, but they're like, if we're going to have to get this mission accomplished, no
Yeah.
matter what they have to do. And it always seems that these generals that can really put themselves out there come from something that provoked some kind of background, in family, or maybe a loss of someone in their family that they needed some kind of outlet. And also, I think to prove to themselves that they're somebody,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. So from different standpoints, making this a good military Thursday now.
Yes.
Um, Evan basically then, slips away. He hitches rides across the country without no more spoiler alerts, but ultimately he makes his way as a stoker on a steamship across the Atlantic, ends up in the Mediterranean, and I won't go any further, but
Yeah.
ultimately he is really on a course. But there's a lot of ambivalence and there's fear.
Mm.
And that also, I think, is an interest. I don't know if you've arrived in your reading to that point, but there's a lot of ambivalence on his part about what he's actually doing now that he's there. And so it's not a singular and uniform decision he's made. It's one that has to be reimagined.
Right.
And so as the book goes on, you'll see that there's different levels of commitment.
Yeah. Well, that's normal, isn't it? Because if you don't
Absolutely. Yeah.
question, then what, then yeah, you've got to question, you've got to think like, hey, and then you're really in this situation going, whoopsie,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's life. That's life. The other thing about your writing, you're talking about, just all these people, just Lawrence, reading their work.
Yeah.
There's something even, when you look at some of, the Persian poets, I think some of the best writing in the world comes from this. And they have like it's not necessarily it's softened, but like right to the point. There's just this I don't know, they're just really amazing. And so when I think like even like Khalil Gibran, the prophet, and things like that, when you read, those kinds of pieces, the way he wrote,
Mm.
did, does that kind of writing influence you? Because there is like a softening, yet at the same time we're going. You know
Yeah.
what I mean
No.
with your
So
writing?
I haven't read in the original, but I've read Hafiz, who's a Persian poet, as well as, of course, Rumi, who was
Mm, yeah, yeah.
beyond Persian. He was, had a much wider voice and a wider audience. And I returned just last year from a trip to Turkey in order to visit the sites that were focuses for Rumi's work. But that's a
Wow.
side issue. Uh, so that's certainly been a major way that I also relate to the region is through that poetry. And again, I
Mm,
haven't written as extensively as I should. I do read a bit in the translation of current Arabic poetry from Palestinian poets. But again,
mm,
that also informs the humanity of both sides. And that's
mm,
terribly important. Of course, Israeli poetry is also something that I love.
mm.
And
The-
again, it really informs a person as to the substrate of where are these feelings of love of land coming from.
mhm. No,
And
exactly. And the
beautiful stuff.
humanity of both sides,
Yeah,
like you said. And
yeah,
I think that's something so important, even like what we're seeing now with Ukraine and Russia. There's a lot of, Russian soldiers turn around and say, I'm not doing this, I'm out, I'm bailing. Yet,
yeah,
that to me, that's a very old war that's happening now. It's the same kind of
yeah.
feels similar in a
Yeah.
way,
It, it's very sad. I guess we're destined to repeat history because not of us, not enough of us remember it.
Hmm.
And so that's where also this comes, I think, as an important uh, juncture because it is very important to know our history.
And the title, Wages of Empire, that is a fantastic title. Now, did you just like, oh, that's it? I mean, what I want to know the process of making a book title
Okay.
because once it's out, it's out.
I know. Okay, I have to acknowledge that that wasn't the original title. This isn't a spoiler alert because nobody cares. But the original title was going to be Sins of the Fathers
Ah.
for this trilogy, frankly, because the fathers of the time, the old men at Versailles who were creating these maps of the world, really,
Wow.
uh, gave us, and I don't know what the alternative would have been, but clearly this didn't work out so well. So Sins of the Fathers really lent itself. Unfortunately, Sins of the Fathers is the title of probably at least a dozen other
Yeah.
books. It's just too damn good. It's too
Mm.
popular. And when I was nearing publication, approaching, about a year off, I remember I came across the title of a book in the historical novel review that I get, and a new historical novel had just come out called Sins of the Fathers, another one. And so I said, this can't happen. And so I then reflected about what I was writing about. I'm writing
Mm.
about empire, whether the Ottoman Empire, British Empire, Russian Empire, but I'm writing about empire or what the Kaiser envisioned as his empire.
Hmm.
And then
Wow.
instead of the idea of sin, because there is a real malfeasance here that's taking place when you're empire building.
And
And
killing.
and of course the wages of sin is death.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's where wages kind of
I,
came.
I I
Wages
love
of,
the title. I think it's fantastic.
yeah.
Because it's you know the empire, the building of an empire. It's we've been doing that for years. I mean, even Star Wars has the empires,
Exactly.
So I mean, when you think about that, you go back to history, it's like, and here comes, they're almost, they want to be lords, like literal lords,
And that's that the beauty and the staying power of that of the series, the empire, that they're
Mhm.
writing about is again, I think, relatable to this because I'm going with it as well. So after Wages of Empire will come the next book, which is going to
Oh,
come out within the next few months, Crossroads of Empire.
oh, good. Oh, wow. All right. So I like this. This is,
And that will continue the story immediately where Wages of Empire ends.
oh, wow. Okay, good, good. So I'm excited about this because I
Me
think you're
too.
really doing some history. I mean, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think your Google history must be fascinating, and you know what I mean, and understanding what you're reading. That's the other thing. I think, it's like like I was saying, it reminded me of like going back to school, going, oh wow, we don't talk about the Ottoman Empire that often. I mean, you just don't, it's kind of shuffled aside maybe in this country. Maybe that's what it is. I mean, I grew up in Africa, so I don't know if that was just a big deal at the time. I don't know.
Well, the fact remains that the world is very crowded with new events, with current events, and it's really hard to have the
Yeah.
bandwidth sometimes to go beyond that. But if it's done in a way
Mm.
that's approachable and that speaks to people, then it's not just dry dates or facts.
No,
It
no, and that
has,
can't be.
and when I read about the Kaiser, when I read about Lawrence, I read about these other
Mm,
characters, they're so relatable to the present.
mm. Well, the thing too, yeah, it is really because people are people at the end of the day. And,
Yeah,
when you have those kind of personalities too, that want to be the Lords, it is it, right? Um, it is fascinating to read it and also kind of brings us up to, hey, are we letting history repeat itself?
yeah,
What are we signing up for here? It's like, why we need to, I think your kind of book is important to bring about thoughts of peace instead of anger.
yeah.
And because all of that is like a big bluster of hot wind, but it destroys so much. And when you can read what happened in history from these, maybe some peace can come from it. And I think it'd be cool to put this into like a Netflix series or something too. Would you let them do it? Come on, you would.
Yeah, in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I think because it's there's so much characters are so important and that's what history is, but to do it right is crucial. Is that something you really work on? Because I mean, you're definitely getting us in there with the people, but it's getting those characters, that's what sells it. Like
Yeah.
you're saying, beyond the dates.
And I don't know what the opposite of a spoiler alert is, but I think it has to be reassuring that I devote several pages at the end to a character list. And
Mm,
so for people who may come across a name, after a few chapters, because the lives and the stories are interwoven here. And these
yeah.
are people who haven't met yet, but generally will at some point in the course of the books they will meet. But we may be writing about a character after a few more chapters when we're dealing with other issues. And so it certainly, I think, will help the reader to kind of flip to the back and say, who was that again?
Yeah.
And and without having to flip back in the book and go
Yeah.
backward.
Well, because history's complicated and so are human beings. We made it complicated.
Yeah. And again, I wanted to also go into depth with characters. I don't have many walk-ons at all,
Yeah.
and so every character here has some backstory, and I want them to care, whether or not I want them to care about Evan or I want them to
Mm,
care about the Kaiser and
right.
what created him. And I won't go into detail here, but there were many factors
Mm,
that flowed into the development of his personality, his
wow.
interesting personality.
I like that you have Churchill in there too, because he's fascinating.
Yeah, well, and again, he's there for a very clear reason. When you get to that point of the book, you'll see why he's important.
Mm, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to have you here on Big Blend Radio.
Thank you very
Everyone,
much.
michaeljcooper.net is the website, but your book's available everywhere through bookshop.org, through Amazon, through all of those places. And people, you could get it in a bookstore. How about that?
Yeah.
I mean, go figure. We can still do but thank you so much. It's been a true pleasure and really appreciate your work that you're doing because I know you've got a good brain to be able to do it, to
Well,
put it all
thank you very
together.
much, Lisa. I really appreciate the time we've spent together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our show.